Continuing Chapter 5, Medieval and Modern Forms of Nature Ritual, from Jesse L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. Mannhardt, discussing this point, remarks that in the mock execution we must recognize a widespread and certainly an age-old practice. He enumerates the various modes of death: shooting, stabbing, in the latter case a bladder filled with blood and concealed under the clothes is pierced. In Bohemia, decapitation, occasionally drowning, which primarily represents a rain charm, is the form adopted. He then goes on to remark that the ceremonial death must have been generally followed by resuscitation, as in Thuringia, where the wild man, as the central figure is there named, is brought to life again by the doctor, while the survival in the more elaborate spring possessions of this latter character, even where he plays no special role, points to the fact that his part in the proceedings was originally a more important one. The Mannhardt was not mistaken, is proved by the evidence of the kindred dances, a subject we shall consider later. There we shall find the doctor playing his old-time role and restoring to life the slain representative of the vegetative spirit. The character of the doctor, or medicine man, formed, as I believed, at one time, no unimportant link to the chain which connects these practices with the Grail tradition. The signification of the resuscitation ceremony is obscured in cases where the same figure undergoes death and revival without any corresponding change of form. The point did not escape Mannhardt's acute critical style. He remarks that in cases where, e.g., the Swabia, the king is described as a poor old man who has lived 7 years in the woods, the 7 winter months. A scene of rejuvenation should follow. This seems, for the most part, to have been lost. But perhaps it only seems so. Now, it used to be winter was typically considered to be the cross-quarter night of November till the cross-quarter night of February. Now we consider it something different. And in between, they considered it something different. They said Halloween to Candlemas. He goes on to draw attention to the practice at Riedeberg by Helle, where after bearing a straw figure called the Old Man, the villagers dance around the maypole, and he suggests that the Old Man represents the defunct vegetation spirit, the May tree, that spirit resuscitated, and refers in this connection to the completely related Asiatic practices of Attis and Adonis cults. The foregoing evidence offers, I think, sufficient proof of the now generally admitted relationships between classical, medieval, and modern forms of nature ritual, but of the relation to early Aryan practice, can that also be proved? In this connection, I would draw attention to Chapter 17 of Mysterium und Mimes, entitled A Popular Procession at the Festival of Soma. Soma was opium, ephedra, and marijuana. And it's also thought that there was replacements with fly agaric, and I'm in pain, so the Hyoma had up to 37 other plants. Some of them actually enhanced it, but here Professor von Schroeder discusses the real meaning and significance of a very curious little poem, Rigveda 9:112, the title by which is generally known, Everyone Runs After Money, does not at first sight fit the content of the verse, and the suggestion of scholars who have seen it in a humorous enumeration of different trades and handicrafts, does not explain the fact that the frog and the horse appear in it. To Professor von Schroeder belongs the credit of having discovered the personal of the poem correspondences of the extraordinary exactitude to the figures of the spring and summer fertility exciting processions, described with such fullness of detail by Mannhardt. Especially is this the case with the Whitsuntide procession at Bardigotzen in Hanover, where we find the group of phallic and fertility demons, who, on Professor Schroeder's hypothesis, figure in the song in concrete and actual form. The vegetative spirit appears in the song as an old man, while his female counterpart, an old woman, is described as filling the handmill. Professor von Schroeder points out that some parts of Russia, the Baba Yaga, as the corn mother is called, kernels, they didn't have corn way back, but corn is how they refer to wheat and other things too, who flies through the air in a handmill. The doctor, to whom we have referred above, is mentioned twice in the 4 verses composing the saga. He was evidently regarded as an important figure, while the whole is put into the mouth of a singer, evidently the spokesman of the party, who proclaims their object, literally knowing different ones. We are seeking good things, i.e. gifts and money, and kind, as such folk processions do today. The whole study is of extraordinary interest for folklore students, and so far as our especial investigation is concerned, it seems to me to supply the necessary proof of the identity and persistence of Aryan folk custom and tradition, a very important modification of the root idea, and one which appears to have a direct bearing on the sources of the Grail tradition, was that by which certain peoples, the role of the so-called God, his responsibility for providing the requisite rain, upon which the fertility of the land and the life of this folk depended, was combined with that of the king. And the Hanover poem. In that poem, besides the ordinary figures, the vegetative entity, his female counterpart, and the doctor, common to all such processions, we have the phallus, frog, and horse in the folk processions. Frosch combining the 2 first, and horse. Well, you can say that the horse is the opium, the frog is the marijuana, and the phallus is the ephedra. But that's my own comment. Mannhardt, Mythological Force, page 142 to 143. Mysterium und Mimes, page 408. Also page 443 to 444. Sir W. Ridgway, as previously cited, page 156, refers slightly to this interpretation of a harmless little hymn. Doubtless the poem is harmless until Professor von Schroeder pointed out its close affinity with the fertility processions. It was also meaningless. Mythological behavior has meaning somewhere, although it may not be apparent. Although there are real events that happen on a physical plane, this was the case among the Celts. McCulloch, in The Religion of the Celts, discussing the question of the early Irish geisha, or taboo, explains the geisha of the Irish kings as destined to promote the welfare of the tribe, the making of the rain and sunshine on which their prosperity depended. Their observance made the earth fruitful, produced abundance and prosperity, and kept both the king and his land from misfortune. The kings were as divinities, on whom depended fruitfulness and plenty, and who must therefore submit to obey their geisha. Okay, geisha would be the singular. And that's why, the sacrifice of the king, that's really why Christianity was accepted initially among the rulers, and the pagans or the hillbillies were, the pagans and the heathens were the poor class generally. I fell down, so excuse that. The same idea seems to have prevailed in early Greece. Mr. A.B. Cook, in his studies on the European sky entity, remarks that the king in early Greece was regarded as a representative of Zeus. His duties could be satisfactorily discharged only by a man who was perfect and without blemish, i.e., by a man in the prime of life, suffering from no defect of body or mind. He quotes in illustration the speech of Odysseus, 1909. Okay. Even as a king without blemish, who ruleth, God-fearing, over many mighty men, and maintaineth justice, while the black earth beareth wheat and barley, and the trees are laden with fruit, and the flocks bring forth without fail. The sea yieldeth fish by reason of his good rule, and the folk prosper beneath him. The king who is without blemish has a flourishing kingdom. The king who is maimed has a kingdom diseased like himself, and thus the Spartans were warned by an oracle to beware of a lame reign. A most remarkable survival of this idea is recorded by Dr. Fraser in his latest edition of The Golden Bough. This is a 1920 book, and is so complete and suggestive that I make no apology for transcribing it at some length. The Shilluk, an African tribe, inhabit the banks of the White Nile, their territory extending on the west bank from Kaka in the north to Lake No in the south, on the east bank from Fashoda to Taufikia, and some 35 miles up the Sohat River, numbering some 40,000 in all. They are a pastoral people, their wealth consisting in flocks and herds, grains and millet. Well, millet's obviously grain, but the king resides at Fashoda and is regarded with extreme reverence as being a reincarnation of Niakang, the semi-divine hero who settled the tribe in the present territory. Niakang is the rain giver, allegedly, on whom their life and prosperity depended. Sort of an Osiris figure in that sort of way, but remember, there's a verse in the Quran talks about God being the provider of Osiris, and that's what people thought of Osiris. Osiris was the provider, and so Sirius the provider, but Osiris was as a personification of Sirius, but on whom their life and prosperity depend. There are several shrines in which sacred spears, now kept for sacrificial purposes, are preserved. The originals, which were the property of Nyakang, having disappeared. The king, the ancient alien people would say, oh, the aliens took it and people were just imitating. Okay. The king, though regarded with reverence, must not be allowed to become old or feeble, lest, with diminishing vigor of the ruler, the cattle should sicken and fail to bear increase. The crops should rot in the field, and men die in ever-growing numbers. One of the signs of failing energy is the king's inability to fulfill the desires of his wives, to whom he has a large number. When this occurs, wives report the fact to the chiefs, who condemn the king to death forthwith, communicating the sentence to him by spreading a white cloth over his face and knees during his midday slumber. Formerly, the king was starved to death in a hut, in company with a young maiden, but in consequence, it is said, of the great vitality and protected suffering of the king, this is no longer done. The precise manner of death is difficult to ascertain. Dr. Sligman, who is Dr. J. G. Fraser's authority, thinks that he is now stranded in a hut, especially erected for that purpose. At one time he might be attacked and slain by a rival, either of his own family or that of one of the previous kings, of whom there are many. But this has been superseded by the ceremonial slaying of the monarch, who, after his death, is revered as Nia King. Their survival is of extraordinary interest. It presents us with a curiously close parallel to the situation which, on the evidence of the text, we have postulated as forming the basic idea of the Grail tradition, the position of a people whose prosperity and the fertility of the land are closely bound up with the life and vitality of their king, who is not a mere man, but as a divine reincarnation, in their own opinion. If he falls into languishment, as does the Fisher King and Perilous Vows, the land and its inhabitants will suffer correspondingly. Not only will the country suffer from drought. Back then the kings had to do something other than rule. Nor are meadows growing green, but the men will die in numbers. Ladies sad will lose their mates. We may say, the cattle will cease to bear increase, and hapless beasts shall bear no young, and the people take drastic steps to bring about a rejuvenation. The old king dies to be replaced by a young and vigorous successor, even as Bronze was replaced by Percival. Now let us turn back to the preceding chapter and compare the position of the people of the Shilluk tribe, and the subjects of the Grail King, with that of the ancient Babylonians, as set forth in their lamentations for Tammuz. There we find that the absence of the life-giving entity was followed by precisely the same disastrous consequences. Vegetation fails. The wailing is for the plants. The first lament is they grow not. The wailing is for the barley. The ears grow not. The reproductive energies of the animal kingdom are suspended. For the habitation of flocks it is. They produce not. For the perishing wedded ones. For perishing children it is. The dark-haired people create Nor can we evade the full force of the parallel by objecting that we are here dealing with an entity thought to be a god, not with somebody just thought to be a man. We possess the recorded names of kings who played the role of Tammuz. Thus, even for the early period of commingling of the two conceptions, God and king is definitely established. Now in face of this group of parallels, whose close correspondence, if we consider their separation in point of time, 3000 BCE, 1200 CE, and the present day, is nothing short of astonishing. Is it not absolutely and utterly unreasonable to admit, as scholars no longer hesitate to do, the relationship between the first and the last, and exclude, as a mere literary invention, the intermediate parallel? The ground for such a denial may be mere prejudice, a reluctance to renounce a long-cherished critical prepossession. But in the face of this new evidence, does it not come perilously close to scientific dishonesty, to a disregard for that respect for truth in research, the imperative duty of which has been so finely expressed by the late M. Gaston Paris? I profess this doctrine absolutely and without reservation, that knowledge has no other object than truth, and truth for its own sake, without regard for the consequences, good or bad, regrettable or fortunate, which this truth can have in practice. When we further consider that behind these three main parallels, linking them together, there lies a continuous chain of evidence, expressed alike in classical literature and surviving folk practice, I would submit that there is no longer any shadow of a doubt that in the Grail King we have a romantic literary version of that strange, mysterious figure whose presence hovers in the shadowy background of the history of our Aryan race. Well, the Aryans are really Hindu, but the figure of a divine or semi-divine ruler, at once thought to be God and King, upon whose life and unimpaired vitality the existence of his land and people directly depends. And if we once grant this initial fact and resolve that we will no longer, in the interest of an outworn critical tradition, deny the weight of scientific evidence in determining the real significance of this story, does it not inevitably follow, as a logical sequence, that such versions as fail to connect the misfortunes of the land directly with the disability of the king, but make them make them dependent I'm kind of lost here. Upon whose life and unimpaired vitality the existence of his land and people directly depends. If we once grant this initial fact and resolve that we will no longer, in the interest of an outworn critical tradition, deny the weight of any scientific evidence in determining the real significance of the story, does not inevitably follow, as a logical sequence, that such versions as fail to connect the misfortunes of the land directly with the disability of the king, but make them dependent upon the failure of the quester, are, by that very fact, stamped as secondary versions, that by this one detail of capital importance they approve themselves as literary treatments of a traditional theme, the true meaning of which was unknown to the author? Let us for a moment consider what the opposite view would entail, that a story which was originally the outcome of a pure literary invention should, in the course of remodeling, have been accidentally brought into close and detailed correspondence with a deeply rooted sequence of popular faith and practice, is simply inconceivable. The remodeling, if remodeling there were, must have been intentional. The men whose handiwork it was were in possession of the requisite knowledge. But how did they possess that knowledge? And why should they undertake such a task? Surely, from the point of view of antiquarian interest, as might be done today, they were no 12th century Frasers and Manharts. The subject must have had, for them, a more living, a more intimate interest. And if, in the face of evidence we now possess, we feel bound to admit the existence of such knowledge, it is not more reasonable to suppose that the men who first told the story were the men who knew, and that the confusion was due to those who, with more literary skill but less first-hand information, remodeled the original theme. In the view of the present facts, I would submit that the problem posed in our first chapter may be held to be solved, and we may accept as a fait acquis the conclusion that the woes of the land are directly dependent upon the sickness or maiming of the king, and in no wise caused by the failure of the quaestor. The wasting of the land must be held to have been antecedent to that failure, and the Gawain versions in which we find this condition fulfilled are therefore prior in origin to the Perceval, in which the wasting is brought about by the action of the hero. In some versions, indeed, has altogether disappeared from the story. Thus, the position assigned in the versions to the feature of the wasteland becomes one of capital importance as a critical factor. This is a point which has hitherto escaped the attention of scholars. The misfortunes of the land have been treated rather as an accident than as an essential of the real story, entirely subordinate in interest to the dramatis personae of the tale are the objects, lance and grail round which the action revolves. As a matter of fact, I believe that the wasteland is really the very heart of our problem. A rightful appreciation of its position and significance will place us in possession of the clue, which will lead us safely through the most bewildering mazes of the fully developed tale. Since the above pages were written, Dr. Fraser has noted the discovery of a second African parallel, equally complete and striking, in Folklore, volume 26. He prints, under the title, A Priest King in Nigeria, a communication received from Mr. P. A. Talbot, District Commissioner in South Nigeria. The writer states that the dominant Juju of Alele, a town in the northwest of the Degema district, is a priest king, selected for a term of 7 years. The whole prosperity of the town, especially the fruitfulness of farm, byre, and marriage bed, was linked with his life. Should he fall sick, it entailed famine and grave disaster upon the inhabitants. So soon as a successor is appointed, the former holder of the dignity is reported to die for himself. Previous to the introduction of ordered government, it is admitted that at any time during his 7 years' term of office, the priest might be put to death for any man sufficiently strong and resourceful. Consequently, it is only on the rarest occasions, in fact, only one such is recorded, that the Juju ventures to leave his compound, and the same time the riches derived from the offerings of the people are so considerable that there is never a lack of candidates for the office. Now, I don't think this ties to glangalol, which is an ginger-like herb that is also called juju, Chinese ginger, various other things, but juju's one of them. But I don't think that has anything to do with this. From this and the evidence cited above, it would appear that the institution was widely spread in Africa, and at the same time it affords a striking proof in support of the essential soundness of Dr. Fraser's interpretation of the priest of Nemi, an interpretation which has been violently attacked in certain quarters, very largely on the ground that no one would be found willing to accept an office involving such direct danger to life. The above evidence shows clearly that not only does such an office exist, but that it is by no means an unpopular post.